All right, I think we're going to get started. Welcome. There's a few seats. If you're looking for seats, there's seats more in the front. It's typically the case. The seats in the back always fill up first, right? So make your way forward. There's plenty up here. Welcome. So great to see all these faces here at the Janus Forum. My name is Rick Vandenberg, and I am a faculty member here in the Grossman School of Business and the director of the UVM Janus Forum. And before we get started, I just want to say a few things about the Janus Forum. It's in its 10th year, the Janus Forum, and we're dedicated to the proposition that we all benefit from constructive debate about how to resolve challenging issues in our society. So our primary mission is to organize events such as this, where we bring in scholars or policy analysts with opposing viewpoints to occupy the same stage and present their arguments on important issues. We encourage civil, open, and constructive examination of alternative views with significant emphasis on avoiding rancorous discussion. So today we are really excited to be holding this debate on whether income and wealth inequality is a threat to our democracy. I would like to thank a few people before we get started that help organize the Janus Forum. The Janus Forum is run by a group of faculty across the campus. And for this debate in particular, I want to thank Caroline Beer from Political Science, Aaron Kinsvatter from Education, and Art Wolf from Economics. We also have a great participation partnership, I should say, with the students from the Lawrence Debate Union, and I really want to give a big thank you to Miranda Ziegler and Lily Oates for their hard work in helping pull off this event. And also, any event like this doesn't happen without a lot of hard work behind the scenes, so let me thank Linda Kruger, Jen O'Donnell, Nick Gingro, who's back here, John Turner from the Grossman School of Business for their help. Importantly, I wish to thank those that make it possible to pay for an event like this. We thank the Institute for Humane Studies, who provided generous support for today's event. And we are most grateful to the Pizza Galley family and the Hilton family for their support. It's due to their support that we have been able to raise enough money to ensure that the Janus Forum will be ongoing for years to come. So thank you very much to the Pizza Galley and Hilton families. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Caroline Beer. Caroline is a UVM professor of political science. Many of you know her. And she's going to serve as the moderator for today's debate. She'll introduce our panelists and discuss the format. So, Caroline.
Thank you all for coming. It's great to see a big full house today. And it's an honor for me to be able to present our two speakers today. First, we have David Madland. He's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. He has a PhD in government from Georgetown University, and he has written about the middle class, economic inequality, retirement policy, and labor unions. His most recent book, Hollowed Out: Why the Economy Doesn't Work Without a Strong Middle Class, was published by the University of California Press in 2015. Our second guest is Michael Tanner. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. He has some ties to Vermont with a degree from Norwich University. He has written extensively on poverty, social welfare, healthcare reform, and social security. He has published a number of books, most recently Going for Broke, Deficits, Debt, and the Entitlement Crisis, published by the Cato Institute in 2015. David will argue that growing economic inequality is a threat to democracy, and Mike will argue that growing economic inequality is not a threat to democracy. All right, so David's going to start.
All right, thank you all very much. Thank you, Caroline, for the introduction, and thank you very much for the Janus Forum for having me, and Rick for organizing. Appreciate it. And thank you all for coming and giving us a forum to have this discussion. For those in the back, there are a couple seats if you want them. You're welcome to stay back there. But so I want to sort of, what I'm going to do is cover a couple of things. First, I'll talk a little bit about the levels of inequality we have in the United States, and then I'll talk about some evidence why I think that's harmful and shows that it's harmful to our democracy. And then last, give you some ideas of understanding sort of what's going on behind that. So to start off, you're probably all familiar with sort of the basic story that economic inequality has risen quite dramatically in the United States over recent decades. Story you've probably seen is, you can think about it as the top 1%, the sort of the share of the total income that the country has, how much is going to those folks. And if you look kind of from the early 1900s, it rose pretty rapidly until basically right before the Great Depression in the late 1920s. It reached sort of a record high, and then it decreased through World War II and then kind of stayed stable. And then in the 1970s, it starts to increase again, and so that we're back basically to the levels we were in the 1920s, just about. I want to just sort of give you a little bit of context of sort of how to think about that, what sort of happened. So if you think about in the 1970s, compare a CEO to a typical worker. The typical CEO compared to a typical worker made about 22 times what the typical worker was. So in Burlington terms, my understanding, the tallest building here is about 11 stories. So if you think of a sort of a strange building that has a CEO living on the top and the middle class on the bottom, that would be about twice the size of the building you have downtown. Today, the middle, basically their incomes have not gone up much. We can have a little debate about how much, but not much. That CEO now earns over 300 times the typical worker. And so that's almost 3 Empire State Buildings, that building, CEO on the top. You're going to hurt your head when you're looking up at that. So it's just a radical difference in levels of inequality where we are today. So now, does that affect democracy? There's walk through some points that I think indicates it does. So you can just look at a simple comparison. Right now, the U.S. is by far the most unequal, rich democracy. And you look at sort of measures of kind of quality of democracy, and you can see these are done by surveys of journalists or political scientists or any sort of ranking that tries to sort of how democratic is a society. And you see pretty clearly that they rank the similar ones at the top, and they're all really pretty equal countries: Canada, Netherlands, the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Australia also. They'll sort of put in those. Those tend to be seen as the more democratic, and the U.S. doesn't rank so well, and it tends to be sliding a little bit. So that's some really broad overview evidence that maybe there's something going on, but you might say, we're America, we're different. That those aren't the right comparisons. So we just think about some broad comparisons with the U.S. over time. Where have we been? When have we been more democratic and less democratic? So if you start even sort of from colonial times, there's this sort of puzzle. Before, think of the New World, and you've got places like Canada and the U.S. that became rich democracies. But most of the rest of the New World didn't become that way. North and South America, mostly all colonized, and they weren't. Didn't have the same outcomes. And so what explains it? Some might say, well, it was that some places were not British colonies like Canada and the U.S. Well, then you've got to figure out, what happened to Jamaica or Belize? So maybe it was climate. Well, what about Argentina and Chile that have similar climates? And to me, the most convincing argument for why the U.S. sort of evolved into a strong democracy and a strong, rich economy was that it was more equal in its founding and origins. People think basically we had a lot more sort of typical yeoman farmers. Yes, we had slavery, but sort of the climate and the land was more conducive to sort of small-scale farming, and so we were a more equal country. And sort of, in fact, surveys indicate that before we became a country, we was actually the most equal society in the world at the time, and that produced these conditions that enabled us to be more and more democratic over time, that we opened up voting rights to more people over time, and we made even sort of basic investments in all the common good, especially in things like education. We were more open to those things. Okay, maybe that's just sort of too much in the back in the history. Let's look at sort of a little bit more contemporary, not too contemporary yet, I'll get to the sort of modern day, but you can look at sort of some of the most unequal times in the past in the U.S. when we were a country, when we were a nation. So the pre-Civil War South, by far, one of the most unequal societies ever. Certainly, you had, a whole group of people that were enslaved. But even when you just look at whites, compare whites, it was a very unequal society because most whites didn't own slaves. And the slave owners, the few that did, owned a lot for the most part. So this was an incredibly unequal society. And what did the wealthy plantation owners do with that power? Well, they rigged the game to benefit them. They didn't want their slaves being taxed. And so they would do things like have really high wealth requirements to run for office. They wouldn't adjust the voting rolls for areas where there'd been population growth for yeoman farmers, so that there would be, the voting rolls would reflect not the true state of society. Or they would change the Constitution to make it really hard to tax their slaves. So, again, past Civil War, maybe that's a totally different society. Maybe it doesn't really relate to where we are at today. So let's go a little bit further forward. As I mentioned, inequality late 1800s, early 1900s was rising rapidly in the U.S. This is a time period from your history books you might remember, known as the Gilded Age, or a period known, we had robber barons. And so this was among the most unequal periods in U.S. history, perhaps the most. And the sort of evidence, most people think that was among the most corrupt times in American society, where the wealthy had incredible influence and power. And just to give, because I'm going to go through a bunch of stuff quickly, just to give you an example of sort of how much money and power controlled our political system at that time. So a former president, Rutherford B. Hayes, has this famous quote describing the period. He's not too long after Lincoln, and so he's reflecting Lincoln in this quote, and he talks about, this is no longer a government of the people, by the people, for the people. It is a government of the corporations, for the corporations, by the corporations. Starting to ring a little truer, perhaps, and feel like maybe this is closer to what we have going on today. So now let's look at sort of our current situation, past several decades. So some evidence that government is doing things that the wealthy want and not what the rest of the public wants, and what sort of you would expect in a more democratic society that would reflect what most people want. So some things, we have evidence that the number of tax breaks, these are special interest tax breaks that disproportionately benefit the very wealthy, things that allow, for example, hedge fund managers to pay lower taxes than their secretaries. The number of those, despite millions of efforts at tax reform, have tripled over the past 3 decades. We also have, individual examples. You can think of things like the Wall Street bailout after the Great Recession that, had basically no strings attached. You can also look at we have corruption convictions have quadrupled. So these are actual, government official has done something illegal, some sort of quid pro quo kind of thing. Those have quadrupled over the past several decades. And then what are the things that the public wants that aren't being done? Think about spending on infrastructure. We like good roads and bridges. That, as a share of the economy, has been in sharp decline. Or things that just aren't being done. We might want more spending on higher education, for example, but that's remained stagnant over the past several decades. Might want to increase the minimum wage. That's worth less today than it was in the late 1960s. So some, pretty good evidence there. I think that some problems with our democracy. We also have polls of what the public says compared to what the politicians actually do, what elected officials do when they're in office. And there's a bunch of several academic studies that look at thousands of surveys, and they find that generally the elected officials do what the higher income folks want, and don't do what the middle class and the poor want, especially when it's in conflict with what the wealthy or people want. Great. And then, so the last piece of evidence about some trouble is even you just polls when you ask people and you can nod your head, and in the 1970s or before, the polls of the public would say, you'd ask things like, do you think government is corrupt or crooked, or do you think it's serving mostly big business or big interests? And overwhelmingly, all those kind of polls show a huge, huge increase in that. Most people say, yeah, it used to be good, not so good anymore. So what's going on? What's happening? And this is sort of one of the most long-standing concerns in political science. You can go back all the way back to Aristotle for sort of a concern that a very unequal society was going to have a hard time staying democratic. And the sort of two kind of concerns that were long-standing concern with the idea that the rich would gain power, just use their wealth to sort of overtake government. And at the same time, there was also a related but different concern that the poor and or middle class would somehow behave differently in a very unequal society. And so let's look at those both clearly happening in the United States. So money might not directly buy a vote, but there's a whole lot of evidence that it's getting money is getting powerful people influence and access and changing the nature of how government works. You can look at things like campaign contributions or lobbying, or just even what politicians do on a daily basis, which is go and try to raise money and talk to wealthy people rather than talking to their constituents. But I'm going to spend more time talking a little bit about that we've also become less civic as a society because we've become more unequal. So economic inequality pulls people apart. It makes them feel that they are different, not connected in the same way. They live a little bit different lives. The wealthy and the poor and the middle class, they become further and further apart. They interact with each other less, and they think they are somehow different. As a result, people are less trusting. And it's very clear that U.S. has become less trusting over the past several decades. We used to be about the most trusting society in the world. You think other people are going to do right most of the time. Now we're nowhere near that. And you can see that that's led to increases in fighting and political polarization. We just don't trust the other side. There's a really nice chart that shows political polarization. Remember I described inequality sort of rising, falling, and rising back up again? If you look at evidence of political polarization, it follows a very similar path. The other thing that inequality, though, does that makes us less civic is it makes us less participatory. We're less likely to do things that are sort of civically engaged and political. We're less likely to join together in organizations. That's sort of, if you for the bowling alone kind of sets of arguments, that we just don't join basic civic groups and do those kind of things. We also even vote less, especially in midterm elections, where there's not a whole host of other things getting us involved, because we feel a little bit powerless and just less connected to people and don't feel as engaged. So to sort of wrap up and summarize, my view is that there's a very close connection between economic inequality and the quality of democracy. And we can see that in evidence from around the world. We can see that in evidence from U.S. history. We can also see it in how U.S. government is working today. And so to me, that gives us a lot to worry about in the future. Unless we do something to address inequality, we are at much greater risk of having the quality of our democracy further erode. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I meant to explain the way we're going to organize this is that each of our speakers is going to talk for 15 minutes, and then they're going to come back and respond for 10 more minutes. So Michael now has 15 minutes. Thank you.
First of all, let me also join in thanking the Janus Foundation and UVM for having me back here after all these years. It's been 40 years since I used to come up here from Norwich because you had much better bars in Burlington. I intend to find out about whether that's still true as we go. So I'm up here to defend inequality, which is, of course, an easy task to do. on that. And I sort of want to start by trying to put the whole thing in context and give a couple of sort of ideas as to why I think that we are overstating the whole problem. And the first is this idea of how bad inequality is. As you just heard, it's bad, it's getting worse. And this is generally the chart that reflects what Dave was just talking about. This is actually from Piketty's book. And as they say, it shows that inequality was very bad up in the Gilded Age, and then it dropped down, and then it's steadily back up there again, and it's as bad or nearly as bad as it was in the Gilded Age. But this leaves out a lot of things. This is particularly noteworthy because this reflects pre-tax and pre-transfer income. So this is just the raw income before anybody's paid taxes on it, and it doesn't reflect any transfers that the government makes to low-income people. And in fact, if you actually look at other measures, for example, you have the pre-tax income up at the top there, which shows a lot of inequality. But if you look at post-tax income, after people have paid their taxes, you can see that it's a lot lower, a lot closer. The gap is much smaller after we've taxed because we have a progressive income tax structure. We tax the wealthy, and after you take that tax away, their income is actually much closer than it was before. And then you have to look at consumption data, and you can see actually in terms of what people are actually spending or what they actually have in terms of their income to spend, you find that the gap is even smaller than it was before. And in fact, if you want to look at redistribution that goes on already in our society, you can see that we redistribute very heavily from the top 1% to people with lower incomes that already exist. And if you look at that after all that takes place, you find out that the income inequality in the United States, post-tax and post-transfer, is a lot less than we thought it was when we were looking at simply raw income data. But I would like to argue that even if there was a high degree of income inequality in the United States, we really shouldn't get all that excited about it. And why should we worry about it? Well, the first idea is we worry about it is because we say, well, look, it's not fair. The rich simply don't deserve it. I mean, after all, this is sort of the idea that we have of, the rich in America. They're either trust fund babies who inherited it all, or else they're a bunch of folks on Wall Street who got rich by moving money around and ripping us all off, right? Isn't that kind of the general idea of what it is? But the reality is that inheritance is not a big part. If you look at millionaires today, you find that 66%, about 2/3 of today's millionaires actually inherited almost nothing. Did not inherit any substantial wealth. They are essentially self-made millionaires. They are the first generation in their family to be millionaires in there. About another 30% inherited something. They did all right, but they inherited less than $1 million, and then now they're millionaires today. They basically took what they had and built on it. And only about 3% have their $1 million or more because they inherited that much money. So essentially, it's not a case of where people are simply passing it down from generation to generation. It is a case where people are actually earning money to become rich today. And if you want to look at why they're wealthy, actually the idea that they are all on Wall Street simply isn't the case. You have managers and supervisors, and businessmen are actually about 1/3 of all the millionaires in America, of the rich, the top 1% today. Medical professionals, financial professionals are only about 10 to 12% of the people that are in the category there. So it's not Wall Street people, it's not inheritance people, it's basically people who are providing for us. In fact, if you look at the rich today, it's much less Downton Abbey and a lot more Steve Jobs. Basically, people got rich in America today because they gave us things that we want, and we were willing to pay for it. They basically improved our lives while they were making money, and that's essentially why people are rich today. Third is this idea that if you're rich, you stay rich forever. If you're poor, you're going to stay poor. There's no mobility. People from the bottom don't move up. People from the top don't move down. Well, I went back about 25 years, and I looked at who were the richest people in America not so long ago. There's not a single melon, by the way, in the list. So if you look at the 400 today, the top 400 richest people in America, not a single melon in there. There's not a single DuPont. There's no Carnegies, there's no Hearst, there's no Rockefellers. Not one of these people that we used to think of as being the dynasty families are still in the top 400 of richest Americans today. Essentially, people move up. And in fact, the evidence suggests that on average, family fortunes are dissipated by the third generation. Essentially, people start off rich, and by the time their grandkids get around to having that money, they're no longer rich. People tend to move down fairly strongly. At the same time, we also know that more than half of people who are born in the bottom 20% of incomes will actually move up over their lifetime. So we still have income mobility up, not as much as I would like. That's largely been unchanged over time, despite growing inequality that remains about the same level. But people do still move up, and people move down in terms of income levels. This is the one I really care about, and that's the idea that inequality and poverty are related. Because I really don't care about inequality at all. I care a lot about poverty. I work on poverty. I try to find ways in which we can raise people out of poverty. And somehow, dealing with inequality doesn't seem to work there. And I want to just sort of do the mind experiment that says, suppose that tomorrow we had some miracle way to double everybody's income. Now, leaving aside inflationary effects and all that sort of thing, but just imagine that if somehow magically we could double everybody's income tomorrow. Wouldn't that be a good thing? Think of how many people would be raised out of poverty if you doubled their incomes, right? But income inequality would actually go up under some measures, and on others it wouldn't change at all. So you'd have done nothing. In fact, you want to cure inequality? Let's have another Great Recession. I mean, think the stock market went down a couple thousand points. All those millionaires lost a fortune. In fact, 1/3 of American millionaires fell out of the millionaire category with the Great Recession hit. Wasn't it a wonderful thing? Don't we want another one? No, it did nothing for the poor. I'd rather be unequally rich than equally poor. Example of this is, in his book, Piketty decries the fact that China, since the end of Mao, basically the advent of Deng Xiaoping, China has gotten far more unequal than it ever was before. It's true. Huge inequality in China today. And 800 million Chinese have been lifted out of poverty at the same time. I'd rather be unequally rich than equally poor. In fact, if you want to look at the relationship between poverty and inequality, the red line at the top of this chart is the Gini coefficient, which generally measures income inequalities. The sort of accepted measure of inequality in society is called the Gini coefficient. The blue lines are two different measures. They're a consumption measure and the standard measure of poverty in this country. And what you can see is that poverty's declined even as the Gini coefficient has stayed the same or actually risen slightly. So even as inequality has actually increased in the United States, we're actually seeing a decline in the number of poor Americans. And we're seeing that on a worldwide basis. The number of poor people worldwide is declining rapidly. In fact, it's declined by about 2/3, I believe, in the last 20 years, even as inequality in the world has increased. So there's no relationship that we can see between the two of them. Top 1% share of income, as you just heard, and absolutely correct, the share of income earned by the top 1% has gone up about 220% since 1990. Poverty has declined over that same period. The number of people living in poverty has gone down over that same period. So even though the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting richer as well. And finally, the big question, of course, right back to our topic today, how bad does income inequality distort the political process? And I would suggest that the basis for that question is this idea that the rich all share the same political ideas and the same political ideology based on class. That all rich people are the same. And I just looked at some of the major players in politics today who will give a lot of money. These are all folks who give tons of money to politics. David Koch, George Soros, Tom Steyer, Sheldon Adelman. Yeah, they all agree on everything, right? No differences there at all. The fact is that they tend to give to opposite sides, opposite parties, opposite candidates, and cancel themselves out. Now, we can argue about whether or not we have too much money in politics. The fact is, though, that we actually spend less money advertising political candidates than we do advertising potato chips in this country. You know, and politics is slightly more important than potato chips, maybe. We can debate that one too. But the fact is that politics is pretty well distributed on both sides of most major questions. And the fact is that many of the people who give large amounts of money in these politics are not rich people or rich businessmen. Labor unions give a great deal. Various interest groups on both sides of debates give a great deal. We can all agree to dislike the NRA, but they give a great deal of money. I mean, these groups are not necessarily rich business people who are protecting their interests. They are ideologically oriented and giving money because they have interests and beliefs in various efforts across the board. I mean, essentially what we can do is look at this and we can say that rich people are simply part of the process. And what do we want to do about that? Do we want to try to tear them down? Do we want to try to have less rich people in a society? Do we want to somehow stifle their voice so that they can't participate? Or do we want to simply say that the process should be opened up to everybody and that we should encourage more people to get involved regardless of what their income is and how they participate? More participation is always better than less. So I don't see where simply the fact that somebody got rich by giving us something that we want somehow threatens our democracy. I think there's a lot of threats out there. And I would close with this, leave you one more thing here. If the answer, if you buy exactly what David has said, and that somehow our government works hand in hand with the rich to oppress us, then why would the answer to that be, let's give more power to the government? If the government is basically nothing but a tool for the wealthy to oppress the poor, shouldn't the answer be take power away from that entity that's oppressing the poor, not give more of it to them? Just something to think about. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So I have 10 minutes now? Great. All right. So I'll go through most of those points and give a little different point of view. But so, yes, taxes and transfers, sort of what government does reduce inequality somewhat. I think, you'd probably agree it's probably about a quarter of the inequality gets reduced, and especially even less at the very, very top end. So, yeah, some modest reduction, but the same story holds true even when you account for all that stuff. Then the idea that people only or mostly get rich by providing useful goods and services. Absolutely, people get rich by providing useful goods and services. They did, not everyone inherits it, but a good percentage do so inherit their wealth. And especially that's more true when you get really high up. So you look at the list of the Forbes list, the very richest families, richest people. Yes, the top 1 or 2, you might even say sort of self-made people, Bezos and Gates, and we'll talk really whether they, so I think those people at the very top, yeah, they provided some useful goods and services, but even then, once they get their power, not always in the public interest. Bezos trying to extract tax subsidies from every city that wants to get his jobs, or become he's a monopoly and crush the little guy who wants to sell stuff, so he can outcompete him. Same thing with Gates and Microsoft, clear monopoly, clearly using their power to weaken competitors. So yes, they both provided a useful service, but once they get really rich, not always. But then also you look at other people on the list, the Walton family, they did nothing. Their dad might have done something, created a business, big business. You add their wealth up, that's more than Bezos or Gates. And then there's folks like the Kochs who are also in the top 15 or so. Yes, they inherited a big chunk of money. They made a lot of it themselves too, but they inherited a big chunk. Yes, we have wealth. Some wealth is generated in great, but then oftentimes once you get to great levels, you don't always do the best things with it. But just want to at least question the basic idea that people are purely getting there on their own. And that gets to the point about mobility, that there hasn't been this, decline in mobility. And so this is actually a little bit tricky, and I think, but it's worth laboring on a little bit. So income is a big predictor. Your parents' income is a very big predictor of your income. In fact, the correlation between your parents' income and your income is the same as your parents' height and your height. It's very close. It's not to say it's the only factor that matters, but there's something going on here. And what we know is that more equal societies, more equal countries around the world have greater mobility. We also know that regions in the United States that are more equal have greater mobility. Yes, we can't pinpoint yet, although some studies do show that mobility has declined as inequalities increase. Some show it staying the same. But that's, in my view, in part because mobility takes quite a bit of time. We have to have the next sort of generation before those studies are going to show more clearly the effect of inequality and mobility. Then I think I spend most of my time on the idea that rich don't all share the same political attitudes, and/or it doesn't really hurt our democracy that much. So it's certainly true that the very wealthy have some range of attitudes. Definitely not all the same, from Soros to the Kochs. Clear that there's money and power on most sides of most issues. But it's also pretty true that wealthy have different attitudes than the general public, especially on economic issues. They don't like taxes, and they don't like things that raise people's wages, unions or minimum wage or things like that. Not always, not every time, but in general, that's fairly true. So you have some clear differences in attitudes between the wealthy and the rest of us. You also have this idea that I think this is part of the most pernicious thing I sort of heard, was that, well, you know what, there's still money on both sides, it's going to sort of equal out and be okay, because to me that theory was the wealthy can dominate democracy so long, and it's fine because that's, if ideas are spread out and issues and interests are spread out, it'll reasonably be okay. But to me, the idea of democracy is all of us have a relatively equal voice. All of us have a say, and we get to choose. Not wealthy get to debate it out, and then it happens for us. We do ourselves. And that is, I think, the absolute essence of what's going on, and what the difference is that it's who are the agents here? Who has the power? Who has the ability to realize and affect the political process? So I share the view that it's about participation, and encouraging and increasing participation is an important part of what we want to do. Well, but the idea that the logic that somehow limiting the amount of money that the wealthy can spend on elections or various things is limiting their participation, I think is a logical leap too far. It doesn't really limit the ability to participate. It makes the wealthy more like the rest of us in the kinds of participation they can engage in. And the take the poor away. The last sort of idea that Mike sort of tried to leave with was the idea that, if the wealthy take over government or have an undue influence, that perhaps the thing then to do is just weaken government itself. And I also think that's a big problem and a big fallacy of an idea. So one of the points of evidence I started with was when the most corrupt and the sort of worst government we had was a very small government during the Gilded Age. Government did very little of the things no Social Security, for example, no, Medicare, none of the kinds of things you sort of think of government tending to do. It was a very small government. It was totally corrupt, and the things it did were for the wealthy and the better. It gave away land. It gave away all sorts of things. You can have a very small corrupt government as well. The ideal situation is to have whatever reasonably sized government you want that to do the things that you want it to do, and doing it for the people that choose and elect it, not doing it for a certain group of people. So the idea is to actually have a reasonable balance of power in society and have the public's will being enacted. That is, to me, the ultimate goal. Actually, I'll wrap up with that the sort of underlying themes that were most disturbing was the idea that other people can do for, and that you can do away or limit the power of government because it might get corrupted, but it actually should be the public making that decision in a democratic process of what they want government to do and who it should be serving.
Yeah, I'm not going to take anywhere near 10 minutes here because I really want to get into the Q&A. I think it's going to be very interesting, to say the least, when we get into that. But I just want to respond to a couple of points. One is on the idea that the rich will dominate. We should that I'm saying let the rich dominate the political sphere. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that they largely don't dominate, partly because they cancel each other out, and partly because what they do is ineffective. The reality is that we are. If you want to look at which candidate spent the most in the last presidential election, it was Hillary Clinton by a substantial margin. Ran more TV ads, spent more money, had more contributions. It's not president today. In fact, you can actually, it's pretty hard to actually trace the highest spending candidate to the candidate that gets elected. There actually is very little correlation between the amount spent in an election and which candidate actually wins. Most of these ads aren't terribly effective and don't do a whole lot of good. And if you watch enough of these ads, as you're stuck doing in Washington, you pretty quickly figure out why they don't do a whole lot of good. That's out there. They're pretty bad. And if you have a terrible candidate or your candidate has terrible ideas, they might end up being president of the United States, but that's not because that you have because of your spending levels in that regard. So I don't think that we're talking about the rich dominating. I'm talking about the rich throwing away a lot of money on nothing. It does that. The second question, of course, is how you're going to stop them from spending this money. The reality is, in terms of giving to candidates, they're still limited in how much money they can give to candidates. There's a $2,300 cap. In fact, one of the reasons why candidates spend so much time raising money is because they can't actually get big contributions. They have to get this in $2,300 increments, so they spend all their time calling people to raise this money rather than raising it from a few large people. Now, that we could say that's good or bad, but the two are actually, the amount of money time spent fundraising has a lot to do with the fact that we actually limit campaign contributions now. So they can't give directly to the candidates, so they give in sort of sideways. They give to universities, they give to think tanks, they give to PACs, they run ads themselves. Limiting that becomes very problematic, how you're going to get around doing that. We can say, well, we're going to limit total expenditures in an election. What does that do to the average person who wants to spend some money? So suppose I want to make a contribution to Bernie Sanders this campaign this season. Well, I'm not really a fan of Bernie, but I don't like his opponent even more. So I want to put up an ad in the Burlington Free Press that says, hold your nose and vote for Bernie. Well, wait a minute. Does that get charged against Bernie? Is that, against his spending limit? That, I mean, it wasn't exactly a compliment to him that I gave him there. On the other hand, or should maybe I be forbidden from taking out that ad and saying that, so my civic involvement be limited? I mean, if we start saying we're going to hit the rich, and we end up hitting the poor. And that is the case with many of the ideas that we're talking about in terms of trying to crack down on inequality. A few years back, but it was probably actually now, I'm going to date myself, it's probably about 20 years ago, someone in Washington came up with the idea that we're going to put a huge tax on yachts. That was going to punish the rich. I mean, the rest of us don't have yachts and stuff like that, and we needed to raise some money, tax money, so we're going to put a huge tax on yachts. And what did we do? We wiped out the American boat building industry. And basically, there's almost no yachts built in the United States anymore. They're now built all over, built overseas. And the result was that 32,000 boat workers in the United States lost their jobs as a result of that yacht tax. Most of those were middle class and working class jobs that were wiped out. So often when we say we're going to hit the rich, we end up hitting the middle class and hitting the poor in terms of these policies. And we can have a lot of debate on, and I'm sure we will, on whether these policies are good, but we should not make the mistake of saying that, well, I have this policy that I think would be good for people, and that policy didn't get enacted, and therefore that has to be the result of some unfair system or something like that. Good Lord, I have a lot of policies I'd like to see enacted, and none of them are likely to see the fruition anytime soon. I mean, I'm a libertarian. I go through life knowing that none of my things are going to ever be enacted. So I think the question ultimately becomes simply one of, are we going to have a society in which people, and certainly some people simply get dumb lucky. If you happen to have been Zuckerberg's roommate, you're now a billionaire and you didn't do anything to deserve it. And some people, inherited it and stuff. But are we still going to have a society in which people can rise as far as their talents take them? And it's still a fact, despite the problems with mobility and all the things we've heard, if you're born among the poorest 20% of Americans, you are as likely to end up in the top 20% of incomes as you are to stay in that bottom 20% of your incomes by the time somewhere at some point in your life. We also have to look at a lot of that data as simply snapshots in time about when people's incomes are and what incomes are and things like that. But the fact is, you're still as likely to move up as you are to stay poor, and the rich are still as likely to move down as they are to stay rich. That's the society that I would prefer to one in which we're all on a level playing field, but all somehow poor. Thank you.
All right, so now we're going to open it up for some questions for our speakers. But since I'm the moderator, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask the first question. I study Latin American politics, and this is a region of the world that has a lot of economic inequality. It also has a lot of problem with maintaining stable democracies. In fact, most of Latin American history has been marked by authoritarian regimes, military dictatorships, and the democracies that have existed have broken down often very, very relatively rapidly. And one of the sort of central conclusions in Latin American politics, and what I see as a central kind of causal mechanism in linking, in the breakdown of democracy, is the rise of political polarization, right? So the idea is that when you have lots of political polarization, when you've got lots of people on the extreme right and lots of people on the extreme left, there's not very many people in the middle to compromise. And you can only have democracy when most people are in the middle and they're willing to compromise. Right, and I think that's a pretty I think that's a general sort of truth in understanding how democracy works. Right, democracy requires us to compromise, and it probably only works when most of us are sort of in the middle of a political ideological spectrum and willing to compromise. And so my question is, what is the link between growing economic inequality and political polarization? We have certainly seen that as economic inequality has increased in the country, political polarization has increased. My gut instinct is that that has something to do with the hollowing out of the middle class, and that has led to a lot fewer people in the center of our ideological spectrum. That's making us unwilling to compromise politically, and that is potentially the causal mechanism that links economic inequality with declining quality of democracy. And I wonder what our speakers think about that, and then we'll take questions from the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think it's more a question of poverty in Central America and Latin America than it is a question simply of inequality. I think they have always had large populations of poor, and that leads to brings its own instability. I also think you have to raise the question of stated equality and actual equality in a society. I mean, you can look at a country like Venezuela and ask, is it more equal today under than it was under the old governments? I mean, yet you have far more people in poverty than you did back then. This is sort of one of those knocking the whole society down to become poorer. Have you made the poor in the society better off? The people who are poor in Venezuela and don't have enough meat to eat today. Now, the question is that the people at the top, it's not, it's not because of capitalism. It's not because, they live a pretty gilded life up there. And the same thing could be said in Cuba and a number of other Latin American countries. If you actually want to look at countries that are doing pretty well, they are actually countries that have some of the freest economies. You look at Colombia, you look at Chile. You can see that those countries are actually doing fairly well, both in terms of democratic norms these days, and in terms of reducing poverty, which I think is the far more important thing. They've actually significantly reduced poverty in both of those countries, whereas poverty has actually increased in Brazil and Venezuela and Ecuador and some other places.
So thank you. I basically agree with the context of your question that, in fact, I was sort of touching on it in my introductory remarks, that there's this remarkable correlation in U.S. history over time between measures of political polarization and economic inequality. In fact, it almost is, follows very closely that chart that Mike presented on inequality. It was rising rapidly when inequality was rising rapidly. It fell during the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, then started to rise again. And in fact, as I also mentioned, this is sort of, I mentioned Aristotle and this idea of inequality being harmful to government. And one of the reasons he, articulated was pretty similar to what you, Caroline, mentioned. That he felt the idea that society polarizes into rich and poor would fight, and that the middle class, if you had a strong, healthy middle class, that would sort of tilt the balance where neither one side could win and would sort of force kind of compromise. That said, I actually think we don't know very clearly exactly, we don't have proof that that's what's happening. We have this idea they tend to go together, but we don't quite know exactly what's happening. What I think is happening, as I also started to mention, is that inequality is very clearly related to trust. It leads to lower levels of trust, and that, I think, is more conclusively demonstrated. And when there's a lack of trust, you think others are unlike you. You don't want to work with them. You don't want to deal with them. And you move further away. You more sharply differentiate yourself from others, and you think the others are harmful and wrong. And you see that, very clearly today. And part of the political polarization we have in the U.S. is not just about being convinced your side is right, but being very convinced the other side is wrong and harmful.
I'm just curious from both of your perspectives.
Yeah, I try to stick strictly in my defense of inequality to economic inequality, which I find very different. I think that we have, the history of racial inequality and gender-based discrimination in this country is pretty much indefensible, and I'm not going to make any efforts there. I think, though, that what we need to recognize is that government has often been the cause of that inequality. If you look at everything from criminal justice history to zoning laws, to our school system, to our banking laws, to occupational licensure, and so on, you can go through a whole list of these things the government has done that have discriminated against people of color and women. But that hasn't necessarily been done at the behest of the wealthy. Often it's been done at the behest of sort of the masses at the bottom who have pursued discriminatory policies. I mean, in many cases, you look, if you look at the anti-immigration policies today, they're not generally pursued by the elites. The average Trump voter is not somebody at the top of the income scale. They are, which is basically why I think that we should have some suspicion of sort of generalized democracy. I mean, the old Athenian idea that everybody will turn out and we'll all vote somebody to be exiled from the city today, type of democracy. And 51% automatically trumps 49%, and whatever the 51% wants, they get. I think that's sort of majoritarianism is every bit as dangerous as elitism. And I think that the founding fathers, for all the mistakes they made, one of the things they did was build in the Republican form of government rather than a Democratic form of government, precisely in order to temper the whims of majorities at any particular time.
So, yeah, racial and gender inequality is, much worse than everything we just described here. Income, women make, 75 cents on the dollar. Also, people of color earn far less than similarly skilled whites. And wealth is far, far more unequally distributed. In fact, what's really particularly troubling is that, so roughly median wealth for blacks is 1/10 whites, and it's not improved. If anything, got worse over recent decades. And to me, what this gets to, though, is we have and how it sort of relates more directly to the sort of points about democracy. We have groups that are even further excluded from the mainstream and part of it, and also more easily scapegoated because they are sort of lose, have less power, less money, less access, and it's expands and perpetuates the basic stories that I was talking about, sort of that when you have wealth concentrated in a particular group of typically white men who have again, that's also why their attitudes are not necessarily reflective of larger society, because it tends to be one group of people that have the great wealth. So yes, it wasn't really a question that you asked, but I think where you were going, I basically agree. Yeah, it compounds the larger problems.
Okay, right here.
So I have a question. I'm having a little bit of trouble making sense of this debate because it seems to me that you said things that directly contradict each other, both as like true statements and statistics. So I think it's a little hard to make sense of that. So one thing that stuck out to me is, Mr. Tanner, you said that people have just as much of a chance if they're born into the bottom 20% of income to make it to the top 10%, whereas you said that income is directly as correlated to height as it is to your parents' income, or the height of a child is as correlated as their income. So I was wondering how both of you got that data, because it seems to me that it's impossible for both of those things to be true. So I don't really know what to believe personally.
Sure, I don't know exact Mike's stat, but I think actually we sort of agree actually on this idea of mobility. Both, I believe, mobility is far less than we would like it to be, and it's not particularly good in the United States at this moment. We might slightly disagree on how much inequality affects that, but I think we would both agree it's low, it's higher in more. Mobility is higher in more equal societies generally across the world. I think we'd also agree on that, and so I think it's possible for both of our stats to be true. Although I leave it to your exact stat.
I don't dispute your stat at all. I mean, I think we're looking at slightly different things. What he's saying is that over a family's lifetime, the parent's income predicts what will happen to the children. And what I'm suggesting is for a single individual, not necessarily dealing with their children, I'm talking about their income over their lifetime is as apt to rise as it is to fall, or to remain stagnant if you're in that bottom 20%. If you were in that bottom 20% and you stay in that bottom 20%, the chances of your children are being in that bottom 20% are high. But if you move up to that top group, your children's chances of being in that top group are high. And so he's talking about the sort of intergenerational effect of mobility, I think, and I'm talking about within a single generation your chances of movement. So we're just talking about we're looking at different snapshots of the same data. It's a problem with all data in social sciences. It's all subject to interpretation.
I have a question about wealth. So it seems like you downplayed wealth a little bit, especially when you mentioned how Hillary spent more on her campaign than Trump. And I don't think, like, in terms of he has all this money that he was given just through inheritance. And I don't think you really highlighted how important that is. Yeah.
Wealth is great. I wish I had some. No. What I was talking about was in terms of campaign spending. If rich people giving to a candidate made it more likely that that candidate would win, or if the candidate who spent the most money on their campaign was most likely to win, then it means rich people would dominate elections because whoever they gave money to would always win. And I'm just suggesting that Hillary actually spent more money on her campaign than Donald Trump did and lost. So the fact is that it's not necessarily who spent the most money or who got the most campaign contributions that determines it. Sometimes it's who has the message for the moment and who's a better candidate, and all these other things play into it. Play into as much. In terms of wealth, look, it's much better to be rich than it is to be poor. I mean, that's sort of obvious. The question is, how can we make more poor people move up? My problem is we spend a lot of the time obsessing about how we can make the rich move down. And I don't care if the rich move down, up, sideways, diagonally, or whatever. I just want to move people at the bottom up.
So I also actually agree here a little bit with Mike, but then I think I'll have a big disagreement. So people spending money on campaigns don't directly, necessarily get the results they want. There's lots of reasons that people get elected, and there's sort of, people spend all sorts of money and get nothing out of it. But in general, the wealthy are the people that contribute to campaigns. In general, they are more likely to get what they want than are the rest of us. And perhaps that's most evident, and this gets to your sort of wealth and sort of Trump being able to run himself. Who runs for office is very clear that it's people who have wealth, or at least pretty high incomes. And that is the share of people from working or middle class backgrounds that run for office and win is small and getting smaller. Look at who's in Congress, who's in the Senate. They're millionaires. Yes, money matters in all sorts of ways for who runs, what they do. It's not a one-to-one thing. It's not pure, clear, and quid pro quo, but it is overall a system that benefits those who have a lot of money, and the more money those who have, the more influence they've been able to exert.
Can we go back there with the blue checkered shirt?
Thank you. So my question, I guess, gets more back to the roots of inequality, specifically Mr. Tanner's comment about how doubling kind of everyone's income is necessarily better. I kind of want to challenge that in that there's this book out there, and there's been lots of studies, specifically it's called The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett, and they really correlate the fact that relative income is directly related to a wide swath of societal ills, from increased crime rates, and it's not so much like absolute inequality, but relative, so how poor one feels to another person. And so even if we double everyone's income, or even, the concept that rising tides lift all boats, I think is slightly problematic when it really comes down to people's relative differences and how those relate. And I just kind of would like to hear some comments about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a very good debate that goes on among social scientists all the time about whether when we talk about poverty, we're talking about relative poverty or absolute poverty and so on. I tend to come down on the side, to some degree, on the side of absolute poverty versus relative poverty. I mean, and I understand the question is that you can have all your basic needs met and still feel poor because the people next to you have so much more than you, and that creates a psychological toll. And so I'm not satisfied was simply meeting a particular level of material poverty. On the other hand, if you want to go, if you want to go to a society, you can find societies in which you have widespread poverty and people are equal. Are they better off if they don't have that? If you want to go back in human history, for the vast majority of time in human history, man was abjectly poor. There was a small aristocracy at the top that lived worse than the poor do today. Would we really want to go back to that society because we could say, oh, well, it was equal, now, yeah, it's true you only live to be 35, but at least the rich and the poor died at the same age. I mean, that's not something that I see as an advantage. I mean, I do think you want to increase for everybody along that. I also think, that basically you have a sort of a diminishing returns aspect at the top. Eventually, it really doesn't matter, if Bill Gates has 40 trillion or 41 trillion. It doesn't really matter to anybody. It matters a lot to whether that person at the $12,000 level gets $15,000 and stuff. So that, if we move everybody up, I think that actually will benefit more people in the long run.
So I'll agree a little bit and then mostly disagree. But I think there is a tension between absolute and relative, and what's more important. But I think it's important to understand the situation that the United States currently is in is not the situation of sort of everyone doubling. What has happened over the past 40 years is that the size of the economy has roughly doubled, but the incomes for the poor and the middle class have barely moved. Almost all of those gains have gone to the very top. So we're not in the situation of everyone doubling. We're in the situation of tenfold at the top and a little bit in the middle and the bottom. And then I also was very interesting to me about the last answer was it's not going to really matter if Bill Gates loses $1 billion or whatever, drops down. So then let's tax that guy a little bit more.
Do you want to? Yeah.
So I'm a little bit skeptical of this idea that the increase in CEO pay over time is tied to an increase in performance or the value that they're adding to society, especially when considering that the wage share of income has fallen in contrast to the profit share of income. So when we look at if the difference in CEO pay to the average worker is, almost 300 times, is that realistically a depiction of how much more productive they are in comparison to workers and the amount of value added? Also because when you consider them in the context of an organization, they're not the only piece that's contributing to the success of the organization.
Yeah, my short answer is going to be no, it's not completely indicative of the value added that they bring to this. Now, to some degree, we can the data is a little. I can dispute the data a little bit here because a lot of what we talk about as income for the CEOs has to do with stock options, and that's basically an unrealized capital gain. It doesn't actually exist other than on paper, and if they actually tried to sell all their stock and so on, the stock would drop, and they do get a lot less than that. So it's basically a paper wealth when you put that ratio in, as opposed to an actual dollar wealth, and so the data is a little bit shakier than I think than the raw numbers suggest. Second, I would suggest that a lot of those problems actually are the result of government getting involved in the marketplace here. Back during the 70s, when we had the takeover wave, and there was the KKR and all these groups that used to come in and take over companies. We put in a lot of stuff that was actually created more homogeneous boards, and that allowed them to block hostile takeovers. And that enabled these boards to become much more insular and give much higher compensation to their CEOs and to the people on the boards and so on, because they didn't have to fear if they were basically someone coming in from the outside and taking them over because they were inefficient. We basically rewarded this sort of insularity within the system. So once again, sort of government had the kind of unexpected consequences of getting government involved in some of these things. So I don't think you actually have the free market that I would like to see in compensation, which I think would actually push it down in some ways. And finally, you just, the fact is that, somebody obviously thinks these guys are worth something. I don't know, I certainly wouldn't pay much to pay some of the money they're earning, but someone's willing to pay for that. And, the number of people who can run these companies is much smaller than the number of people who can do other jobs in these companies, and you do have to deal with the laws of supply and demand at some point.
I don't know that there's that much to respond to, other than just look, I agree. CEOs, I made a similar point, so I definitely agree with the premise of the question. But the one thing Mike mentioned was just, and he's comes back to this idea that government's actually the source of the problems, kind of thing. So he mentioned it in race, especially, and I wanted to get on that. Yes, U.S. government has there's a whole variety of things you can point to that have created major racial or exacerbated major racial problems. But you can also look at things like the Civil Rights Act that dramatically improve conditions for people of color and women. And so it's really, again, who is doing what for. That's the question about sort of whether a government is doing good things.
Let's talk about this for a minute, because I think this is an interesting one. I sort of reckon that the government breaks your leg and then gives you a crutch and expects to get patted on the back for what it's doing. The government certainly has done a number of important things, like the Civil Rights Act and so on, belatedly when it gets there. But in many cases, all the governments do is cleaning up its own mess that it's out there and done. So I don't think we should get too excited about that. And well, I'll just leave it at that.
Well, there's questions. We'll go.
Can we take this question right here?
So I am a professor of public administration. So I'm going to try to defend our public institutions for a second here, in spite of Mr. Tanner's bashing, I suppose. The question I have is, what is the democracy that we're actually arguing about? We have at least the premise embedded in our Constitution, the premise of a liberal democracy, and again, not liberal versus conservative, but the extension of enfranchisement of rights to individuals. Or are we facing and are careening towards more of an illiberal democracy, where we get majority rules that is swayed by manipulation through agenda setting, through framing, media framing, through charismatic leadership, et cetera, and that what is happening, or I fear is happening, and I'm not the only one feeling this. If you want to take a look, I would highly recommend a book by Yascha Mounk, a Harvard professor, called People versus Democracy. And in that, he cites statistics, surveys globally towards greater openness towards authoritarian rule. And that's happening in this country as well. And precipitously, those numbers started to trend in the negative direction away from democracy when we did see income inequality in the United States start to grow, despite the statistics that Mr. Tanner showed. I would encourage people to take a look at The Economist and among many other, even conservative sources that would counteract his overarching narrative. So my question here is, what democracy are we trying to preserve here? And are we doing a disservice by bashing our public institutions and systematically undermining our institutions along the way? And so we're eating at the integrity of public institutions from both ends. And my fear is that we won't have anything, and maybe that's the libertarian dream, I don't know. But what is the future of public institutions in your model?
Well, first of all, I like your distinction, and I think that worldwide basis liberal democracy is under attack. And I think it doesn't necessarily have, correlate with inequality. I mean, you can look at it in countries around the world that are challenging liberal institutions: Poland, Hungary, even Italy now. France, I mean, though I think Macron has probably held it off for a while, but you had the rise of Le Pen. I mean, the liberal democracy is something that's really under threat. Basically, I take my cue for liberalism going back to the Enlightenment, and I think it's based on the idea of the individual and the idea of each individual being of equal value, equal worth, and having equal rights. Myself, I tend to think that speaks in favor of civil society and opposed to public institutions, which are based on a collectivist notion of majority rule. And I do tend to think that we should minimize government and coercive control and maximize individual freedom, individual liberty, and individual ability to make decisions in their own lives. Now I'm not, while philosophically I may have, an anarchist, trend or tendency. The reality is that I'm not. I do believe we need public institutions, but when institutions try to do too much, they fail to do anything well. Institutions that try to be everything to everybody tend to not fulfill their basic goals and missions, and I worry about that. But I am deeply concerned about the rise of illiberalism in this country and around the world.
So on the broadest idea of sort of what democracy is about, and I think it's about, and I think actually we're in somewhat agreement among all of us that it's this combination of both majority rule and protection of individual rights at the same time. And to me, what's most worrying is we have both forms, problems with both forms, and currently we have we have this illiberal democracy that you're describing as well, where basic civil rights are under attack for lots of people. But we also, at the same time, don't actually have majority rule either in lots of ways. From whatever you want to focus on, gerrymandering, etc. So to me, democracy is under threat in both ways at this moment.
Aaron?
To what extent are income disparities between various racial and gender and ethnic groups explained by factors like racism and sexism?
I would say less in terms of income and more in terms of wealth. Gap, especially racially, is huge. The fact is, if you look at the amount of wealth that African Americans have been deprived of over history in our society, starting with the fact that as slaves they couldn't own any of the resources that were earned through their own labor, through the Jim Crow era when their ability to accumulate wealth was suppressed, even into the modern era when they are more likely to have things like housing discrimination and redlining and criminal justice issues and things like that, all of which deprive African Americans of wealth. I think that the gap in black and white wealth gap is enormously the result of racism. I think in terms of gender disparities, that sort of wealth gap is a little bit harder to prove simply because you don't have direct lines of inheritance. Because you're not necessarily passing from woman to woman. You might have men intervening in generations, but you do have the fact that women couldn't own property until fairly recently, and historically, and the fact that they were denied access to various professions and so on, and that does have consequences in terms of their children and in terms of their women's ability to earn in today. So it's still out there, and it's still an issue today, but I think it's probably higher on the racial side than it is on the gender side.
I'd agree with that basic framing. It definitely more wealth, but it's clearly also still, racism still affects even income. So if you started with the greatest story where Mike says, it's hard to measure racism, exactly how much that's affecting, but it's sort of clear, there's all sorts of economic studies where they say, we're going to control for education levels and skill levels and experience and all these kinds of things, and then there's this remainder that they kind of can't explain, and they say that's probably some sort of discrimination, and that's still a significant factor in pay differences. And then you have sort of even things that they can sort of measure, like, well, you choose a certain kind of occupation or an industry to go into. Well, that has sort of a historical legacy for why that became, so even things that aren't sort of directly, racism now have some sort of legacy on income. And I think we're simply, yes, there's a long legacy and something going on today as well.
We have right here in the middle. Yeah, you.
So, a lot of what you've just talked about was like disparities between gender and race, and a lot of that also has to do with like education and how like their parents can prepare them. I think at one point you said income was related to their parents' income before them, and how does that like factor in with wealth and financial education? That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of studies out there that show that your parents' attitudes towards education reflect your attitudes towards education. Parents who believe education will have an opportunity, will enable their children to rise, are far more likely to have children who get the education they need. For example, parents who believe that they're going to encounter barriers and that education isn't going to help, their children are less likely to go on to college and so on. So there's an enormous amount of effort to suggest that parental attitudes lead to children's attitudes when it comes to education. There's a lot of that as well. You also, of course, have there's a whole bunch of evidence out there that suggests that wealthier parents, in terms of the way that what their children hear, the amount of books in the household, what their children hear in terms of how many words and whether those words are encouraging and discouraging and things like that. There's an enormous amount of evidence to suggest that does have impact on subsequent generations.
So again, I think we'll mostly agree on this, that how income from parents translates into income from kids is both a measure of sort of what money directly buys, perhaps a better school or a better school district or things like that, as well as kind of some of the behaviors and attitudes that might be passed on. But I think there's also some clear things that even in the attitudes and behaviors that are income enables you to have a more stable household where just things aren't as chaotic and the environment towards learning is able to be nurtured more easily. And then whereas the sort of generational wealth transfer, how does wealth transfer? That is both, in these sort of kind of leads to higher incomes, but especially it's about direct money going from parents to kids, not just that they got a better education or kind of things like that.
I was just looking for a reaction. When the president was elected, he refused to divest of any of his major holdings. His ethics commissioner actually resigned over it, and I mean, it seems pretty indicative to exactly what we're talking about. Is wealth a threat to democracy? He's put a lot of money through these properties, through the taxpayers, and I was wondering if I could get a reaction.
Well, I'm much more worried about the fact that this is a president who thinks Nazis are okay. Than whether or not he's got, making some money because people are staying at the Trump Hotel in Washington. I mean, in terms of the many things I'm offended at by this president, that's way, way down on the list. I do want to mention, just if I could take just a second in terms, because we had so many these questions about the inheritability of wealth and the inheritability of income and so on, and is that now that we're actually getting the first generations of black wealth and of women-owned wealth, why would we want to suddenly start punishing the rich? Why would we start wanting to take away inheritances from the first African American millionaires? When they're widespread, it's why, by the way, that Ebony magazine came out against the inheritance tax when that was being debated, because you had the first generation, or first widespread generation of black wealth. You would think you'd want them to be able to pass it on to their kids.
So, Trump, I think also with Michael and with the spirit of the question. Look, Trump is clearly a threat to democracy in lots of different ways. But I think what's, sort of in some ways the theme of my talk was it's not just about Trump. These are much broader trends that are likely to lead to something like or worse than Trump next time. And I also think they're part of how we got Trump. Now, it's not that we high inequality that we had Trump. It's nothing like that, and it's very clear that racism was almost the most important factor in leading to Trump getting elected. But if you look at sort of some of the other elements that had to come into place for him to be elected, I think you'll see the sort of role of inequality and stagnating wages. So first, he claimed he was going to be a different kind of Republican and actually work to raise workers' wages. So he was campaigning on sort of the failure of a whole generation of political leaders, and he was going to be different. He also claimed that, many of his supporters said this guy is totally unqualified, should no business in being elected. But you know what? I hate the other side so much. I'm just a total partisan, and so I mentioned this idea of political polarization due in part to inequality. Then this, as I said, also that they thought he was unqualified. They felt like blowing the system up, and that was worth it. And that's sort of also what you see historically from high levels of inequalities. People feel they have less to lose, that there sort of doesn't matter anyway. I got no agency here anyway. Let's just throw a bomb and see what happens. And so I think there's a lot of channels you can sort of see how Trump would not have been elected but for the underlying economic conditions. Certainly racism was the central part, but he also sort of racialized economics. He found his scapegoat in others. Why aren't things going very well? Those others.
Right here.
Yeah. So, looking, I guess, on a more on a more micro level, but also looking at the fact that I think has been previously not untouched upon, but not explicitly stated, that we're not only a democracy, we're a representative democracy. When you both agree that wealth and income are unequally distributed between like groups, intersectional groups like race and gender, wouldn't you say that at the point where wealth affects just like day-to-day participation in politics in terms of like being able to contribute to a campaign, being able to leave your job to go vote, having access to like information and education to make informed decisions about your voting, or even just like being able to get to your polling place, realistically, when all of those are somewhat based on wealth or income that you have, or like the level that you're at in society, wouldn't you agree that at least on a micro level, like wealth and income do affect participation in a representative democracy?
Yes. But the question again for me is whether were we better off bringing up the bottom or bringing down the top in those regards. I mean, I'm open to discussions, whether you want to talk reparations, whether you want what policies we want to talk about in terms that can raise up the bottom or make up for the bad things we've done in the past. But I don't know but I don't know what taking away money from the rich and making them poorer is going to do to increase participation at the bottom rungs of the level at all. The fact that people can't take time off from work to go vote, the fact that people have trouble with transportation to get to their polling places is not going to be made better the next time the stock market crashes and the rich lose 10% of their income.
So yes, I agree with the premise of your question, but I want to sort of also take on a little bit what Mike's saying, because sort of the solutions that sort of we haven't really actually been discussing solutions, but it sort of seems to be always assumed that just the only solution is sort of somehow take away money from the rich, and I certainly support higher taxes on the wealthy. But I think one of the sort of, and then all of the kinds of solutions in terms of increasing people's ability to participate are certainly part of it. One of the central things that in terms of solutions that I think rarely, if ever, is talked about, and I think people not see it this way, is we need to strengthen labor unions. And the two things that does is gives people more power in our economy so that they can negotiate for higher wages, so that the wages just don't go to those at the top, it goes to everyone. But they also, and this is central, help bring people together to have a voice in politics. In our political society, the individual votes almost hardly matter whatsoever. What matters is a group of people doing something, and then they have some influence both at the voting booth, but also especially monitoring what politicians do. Because any individual, it's sort of a Herculean effort to sort of pay attention to every little thing and make sure that the politician is following up on what they said they were going to do. And that takes an organization. And the really only sort of organizations we have that bring together classes and represent, especially working in middle class, but they bring together all classes, LeBron James and janitors, are labor unions. Yes, some churches do this, but their central goal isn't about power in the economy or power in the democracy. So I think that's the kinds of solutions we need are as much about building power for ordinary people.
I think we have time for one more question. And before I take that one question, I want to ask everybody to please take the time to fill out a survey about the, I think it's right there, yeah, about the debate for our funders. And also to take the time to text the poll has a glitch. Okay, so we won't do that. Okay. All right, one last question. Does anyone have a last question? All right. All the way in the back.
So we talked about taxation, and we also talked about bringing up and doubling wages, but we never really overviewed minimum wage and raising minimum wage, and I'd like to discuss that and its impact on inequality.
Yeah, this is one we're probably going to disagree on quite a bit. I think while the literature has grown muddier, I think, in terms of the minimum wage over the last couple of decades, I still think the overwhelming consensus on the minimum wage is that ultimately what it does is benefit the minimally skilled at the expense of the even less skilled. Essentially, one group moves up with the minimum wage and they do better, but the people with the skill level right below that actually lose jobs. And the fact is that the people with the most minimally skilled in our society are the most likely to be eliminated through automation. You can see we're already going to fast food places, and now you push a button on some sort of kiosk rather than somebody behind the counter increasingly. So I think what you're actually going to do is essentially wipe out a level of low-skilled jobs and prevent people from getting in on that first job on the income ladder, which is vitally important in terms of moving up. Most people who earn minimum wage actually move up. About 70% of them are above the minimum wage within a year. So I mean, I think it is a starting point that we need to let people get in on in order to move up. And the simple fact is, you think of the reductio ad absurdum argument on it, but it serves a point. Is that if we could just arbitrarily raise wages, why stop at $15 an hour? Why not make $100 an hour that everyone has to be paid, or $1,000 an hour? You say, well, that's ridiculous. It said, if we did that, nobody would be hired. Well, at some point, even $15 an hour becomes an unbearable burden for small businesses that have a very small profit margin and so on. So I think ultimately that we've got to be very careful that we don't have unintended consequences to something like that.
So yes, I'm all for raising the minimum wage. I think the evidence is very clear that raising the minimum wage boosts workers' wages as it's supposed to. It reduces poverty as it's supposed to. So it's very clear. Now, whether it has any employment effects is definitely debated, although I think the evidence is growing more and more clear, especially as places like Seattle have gone very, very high minimum wages. And you see, wow, all these employers who claimed, oh my goodness, we're going to put me out of business, and lo and behold, now they can't even find enough workers because the economy is booming so much. So I think there's minimal evidence that it has some harmful employment effect, but let's just even concede that it does. There's still a very strong case for the minimum wage as a moral statement that work should pay, that you shouldn't be living in poverty if you're working full-time. And if there was any disemployment effects, there's plenty of ways to compensate for that if we wanted to with other additional complementary policies. So, I think the minimum wage is one of those no-brainers, and it's also one of the clearer evidence of the amount of power people with wealth have. Raising the minimum wage is one of the more popular policies you could imagine. 60% support pretty much always anywhere, yet the federal minimum wage remains $7.25 an hour. Yeah, it's low. Then you also have all sorts of things. Cities in tons of across the country are trying to raise the minimum wage. If they're in states, especially that are controlled by Republicans, they're being told they can't. So no way. We won't allow democracy. Psh, psh, you guys don't know what you're doing. We will just prevent you from doing that because that would go against what we want. Even had that in Washington, D.C., where I live, city of Washington, D.C., there was an initiative that would have raised the minimum wage even for tipped workers. Public supported it. Elected officials decided to, all Democrats decided to overturn it. They didn't want, no, you guys didn't know what you were doing. So I think minimum wage, good policy, public likes it, and also clear evidence that we don't quite have the democracy we should.
I want to thank everyone for coming, and also let everyone know that we have a reception afterwards, and we have some gifts for our speakers. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to you for coming. And there's a reception right around the corner here. So I hope you'll join us. Thank you.